I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And together we're the History Boys, looking every week at events and personalities that brought us to the place we are today, on the principle that you can't work out how to get out of here if you don't know how you got here. Today we're looking at the Vietnam War. We can't do justice in the time available to the whole of the Vietnam War, not least because it lasted for 30 years, first against French colonialism, then against American imperialism. Second, because the Americans expanded the war into neighboring countries with devastating genocidal results. We will talk about how the wars began, but we want to focus, I think, Adam, on how the war came to an end. What were the factors in play that brought the war to an end? So Indochina was a French colony. The Vietnamese people rose up against their Japanese occupiers during the Second World War. But when the war was over, a somewhat enfeebled France, a somewhat comic opera colonial power, thought that they could walk right back in and take up where they left off. It didn't work out that way.
And we saw the similar reappearance of almost equally, if not more, comical Dutch in Indonesia, the British in Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, and there are countless other examples, the Americans in the Philippines. But the French war in Indochina was particularly brutal because, as was the case in China itself, where Mao's partisans formed the core of the best anti-Japanese occupation fighters, so too in Vietnam, in what was then called Indochina, did Ho Chi Minh and the partisans, the left, form the bulwark with which the people were able to cast off the shackles of a very brutal Japanese occupation. Of course, for the French, that wasn't good enough, so much so that in 1949, they created a puppet government of sorts called the State of Vietnam. Well, by 1954, the French were just vanquished. They simply could not fight. Yes, they had more modern weapons. Yes, they had the clean uniforms, but they didn't stay clean for long because Ho Chi Minh and his partisans routed the French. But the State of Vietnam wasn't done with hoisting the colonial flag with Vietnamese characteristics. This became incredibly clear in 1954 when there was a largely forgotten conference called the Geneva Conference, where all of the great powers were trying to figure out what to do with both a divided Korea and with a divided Vietnam, where both Ho Chi Minh and his partisans claiming that the state was rightly theirs, but with this French pseudo-protectorate, the State of Vietnam, also claiming that they were the legitimate forces. In terms of Korea, no one could agree on anything. It didn't even get off the ground. In terms of Vietnam, the disagreements were so pronounced that it led to a kind of deadlock, this time with the Americans backing the de facto leader of the State of Vietnam, Ngo Dien Diem, who said that he would not hold democratic elections because he'd lose. The way that
he was honest.
He was. The way the Americans phrased it was a bit less honest, that, an election with communists will be...
Wouldn't be in the national interest.
It would be meddled by the Russians and the Chinese, and we're very familiar with this rhetoric. So what happened is, after the Geneva Conference effectively failed, Vietnam remained partitioned between a communist North and a US-friendly South ruled by Diem. And that would have been the end of it, but the Americans crept in. So where North Korea and South Korea existed in a state of effective stalemate, military advisors, as they were called, began appearing in South Vietnam as early as 1954, 1955. This begs the question, when did America's war in Vietnam really begin? The answer to that question is an infamous false flag attack. And I know we hear that term battered around a lot, but this was an actual false flag attack, much like the sinking of the Maine off of Cuba, which began the American Empire. But this was the alleged attack on American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin Bay. And from there, it was all over the news, and President Lyndon Johnson, who was the very grim successor
You think Johnson knew it was a hoax?
Information that's come out in the 90s and 2000s indicates that Johnson did know it was a hoax, as he knew the sinking of the USS Liberty was deliberate rather than accidental. That obviously relates to the Middle East rather than Vietnam, but it does show that Johnson was wicked rather than stupid, at least according to what a lot of those who have dedicated their lives to this do say. Officially, for the sake of equal time, the jury is out, but not this jury. So that led to Johnson getting both houses of Congress to give him the powers of war without actually declaring a war. So while Vietnam was one of America's longest and most deadly wars, it wasn't actually a war so far as the legalese is concerned. But boy, was it. Just jumping back before 64, Diem was executed in a coup. Diem, the man that America loved right up until the moment they didn't. Diem was obviously controversial. He himself suppressed the Buddhist Vietnamese throughout the last several years of his rule, he favoring the Roman Catholics, like the good progeny of a French government that brought a European religion into, or at least a European style of religion, into Southeast Asia. Diem, however, was eventually executed with the complicity of the CIA, and it was applauded because they built him up and then brought him down. But as Ho Chi Minh prophetically said, he said they've killed their best puppet, the lost vestige of even the remotest form of legitimacy of this very comic opera South Vietnamese state. In 1968, though, there was a huge watershed in the war. This was at the peak of the anti-war movement in many respects.
This is the Tet Uprising.
Indeed.
A military failure, a political success.
Absolutely. The US killed so many during this, and it was within the context of this Tet Offensive that you see the My Lai massacre, which just brought to bear the kind of brutality that these Americans, who were frankly going nuts in Vietnam, the average
drug-fueled,
yes,
incredibly frustrated and furious that they could not prevail, they began murdering all and sundry.
Absolutely. And the reasons for this were twofold. The military leadership at the time was simply not up to task. The Defense Secretary McNamara was a man fraught with his own contradictions, but the other reason was because when you draft an army, when you conscript young men into a war so remote, so nebulous to the average person, because of course the rich weren't drafted. No. They could be college students, and they could...
Or like President Trump, they could have bad ankles.
Oh, of course. And there were. You can still to this day talk to Americans from that period about some of the ridiculous things, including defecating in their own trousers, that they did to prove that they were insane, just so that they wouldn't have to go to this war. And then there were, of course, honorable, very honorable people who refused to go on the basis of conscience, the most famous being Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer of all time, a man who fought inside the ring rather than in the imperial circus. So I certainly think that of all the people, not to dodge the draft, but to resist the draft, because there's an important distinction.
Yes.
And that was him. But the Tet Offensive was something that was immortalized on the color televisions that were just about everywhere by the late 60s in the United States.
Now, this is one of the main reasons for the US defeat, isn't it? That for the first time, the daily, hourly attrition, not least, in fact, overwhelmingly, their own service personnel, they didn't give a damn about the
Correct.
Vietnamese, but the mass media were there, and their dispatches, their footage, was on the nightly TV screen the next day.
Absolutely. You could see the bodies burned by napalm. You could see photos of the atrocities, people being shot at point-blank range, the pictures of women who were quite obviously raped by these disgruntled, maddened servicemen. And so it became a war where the brutality recirculated, where even though the sympathy of mainstream corporate America wasn't with the Vietnamese, The way the US troops were behaving in Vietnam was a source of embarrassment. And Walter Cronkite, who was one of the main news readers at the time for CBS News, his coverage of the Tet Offensive, I mean, it's hard to believe in this advanced 21st century that a newsreader might actually vocalize some empathy for an unnecessary and brutal war. But in the 60s, that did happen. And it spawned an anti-war movement among the young people who either they didn't have their draft number called because it was a random system, much like a green card. What's worse, I don't know. Depends on one's perspective. And then there were those who were in the universities, but they became politically aware. It was reflected in, first of all, the music. Before it trickled into film and even literature, the music really defined that generation's opposition to war. Songs like Edwin Starr's War, What Is It Good For? Country, Joe McDonald's Fixin' to Die Rag, 1, 2, 3, What Are We Fighting For? Don't Ask Me, I Don't Give a Damn, Next Stop is Vietnam. These were very direct anti-war lyrics, and there were hundreds of songs about the war from pop acts on both sides of the Atlantic. It inspired the student uprising in Paris in 1968. It was one of the examples where, for the first time, frankly, in modern history, an imperialist war in a far-off place compared to the United States was having repercussions in Western society, and that frankly was because of mass media. You could press a record comparatively quickly, you could get the news bulletins with color photos and video out within 24 hours or less, and this was being beamed into the minds and ears of people not just in the US but in Europe.
Dylan played an honourable role in
Absolutely.
the anti-war movement. It was overwhelmingly a black army, wasn't it? Or not overwhelmingly, but disproportionately a black
Disproportionately.
army. So in this random selection process, the Bushes and the Trumps ended up not going, but huge numbers of young black men were going. How did the anti-war movement play in the black community in America?
It tended to coincide with the civil rights movement. So while white students were primarily concerned with the anti-war movement, and initially the civil rights movement that began in the age of Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, later on Muhammad Ali played a very important role in that, they tended to dovetail by the late 1960s. And so while Martin Luther King was shaking hands with the president in 64, when he realized, at least in a legislative sense, the dream about which he spoke for equality to be legislated in the Civil Rights Act, by the late 60s, he had begun to speak about Vietnam. And as his voice was one of the least radical in the civil rights movement, which later became an increasingly radical black liberation movement, people got worried. And he was assassinated in 68 under very dubious circumstances that many link to his increasingly outspoken position on Vietnam.
Muhammad Ali encapsulated it well, didn't he, when he said he didn't want to go and fight America's war. He said that no Viet Cong ever called me the N-word. He empathized with brown people being murdered by white and black people for the power and wealth of white people.
Yes, indeed.
It was, I think, an important turning point. So you have this mass movement, not just in the US, but around the world. I was myself a part of it. At the age of 14, I attended my first ever demonstration in Grosvenor Square in 1968.
Outside the US Embassy?
Under the leadership of Tariq Ali, who's still going strong. Outside the US Embassy, policemen's hats were coming off, their horses were falling over, ball bearings had been thrown under their feet. It was a riot, actually, and 100,000 strong in Grosvenor Square. So the radicalization that was apace as a result of the war must have worried Western governments, particularly in France, where you could argue the government almost fell at the height of les envahments the events in 1968.
Absolutely. 68, for all of these reasons, was a watershed. Just as a side note, Tariq Ali got a song written about him because of that Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones.
Oh, really?
One of the few times they ever went into the political. Soon after that, they went back into the boudoir.
They took the exile to Main Street for tax reasons.
As many did later on. But yeah, he got a song out of it. But yes, France almost collapsed. There was no real threat that the US government would collapse. It was too strong. But de Gaulle, who was in his final years, really became a creature. He tended to represent what the French literally would call the ancien regime. And another figure, while de Gaulle ultimately didn't get killed, but his career wound down slowly, one man who was a mainstream candidate in the United States primary elections in '68 for the Democratic Party, a man who wanted to end the war, a man who spoke out in favor of the civil rights movement, a man who just before he got killed delivered a tear-soaked elegy to Martin Luther King. This was Robert Kennedy, who that same year, months later, was gunned down in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He was a candidate who would have likely ended the war, and going up against Nixon, if his brother's track record was anything to go by, he would have won, but Nixon won in the end.
Of course, we mustn't over-orientalize this. Although the anti-war movement in the US and the world was an anvil of sorts, the hammer was the heroism of the Vietnamese fighters themselves.
Absolutely.
The heroics that they performed are almost difficult to describe. These were people from a poor country, ill-clad for warfare, poorly armed, though systemically armed, mainly from the Soviet Union, to some extent China. But none of that would have been of any use without the bravery of the Vietnamese people, who encapsulated, didn't they, the old saw, that it's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog that counts.
Absolutely. And while the US, frankly, lost in Korea, though it was disguised as a stalemate, and while the US has taken disproportional credit in its own propaganda for winning the Second World War, when frankly the Soviet Union could have won that war alone, and largely did in the areas of combat that really counted, it was in Vietnam where the idea of America not only losing a war, but losing it so badly really rose to the fore. And for this, one has to give credit not necessarily to the cameraman that we talked about earlier, they just delivered the message, but to the men being photographed, the Viet Cong fighters of the South.
And women.
Yes, and women. It was a very much all hands on deck.
Yeah, definitely. I must tell you, I was 21 years old in the flower of my radical political activism. The day that the Vietnamese tank crashed through the gate of the American embassy, the pictures of the American embassy staff, including the ambassador, clattering off the rooftop, with people hanging on to the runners, papers scattering in the wind, the US empire utterly defeated by this peasant army.
Volunteers,
everyone. This peasant army chasing American imperialism off the roof of its own embassy in what had long been effectively its puppet capital, then called Saigon, is possibly the most iconic, emblematic event of my life.
It's hard to argue with that. The images were so strong. You see Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, in tatters. You see the evacuation of the lost American troops, and far more than sort of British-clad soldiers playing the last post at a very orderly retreat. This was chaos.
Yeah.
You see the images.
It wasn't even retreat under fire. It was a chaotic scramble for safety.
And then you saw them actually pushing the helicopters off of the decks of ships so that they couldn't fall in to the hands of the then